Now, good morning, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C. So I know this morning we have lots of people interested in the topic of public procurement, and this topic is very timely for right now what the entire world is facing, COVID-19 pandemic, whatever name we give it. And we have a very large number of people who are interested in this topic. I think registration is over 190 people, and I'm expecting a pretty significant number of folks joining in this morning. And my name is Sumant Timsina. I'm the Executive Director of International Development Institute, and I'm here just to introduce the Institute and today's panel. So we are based in Washington, D.C. We are capacity building, training, development organization primarily, but we also do a site consulting. And we have a public procurement is an area of interest for us and for many of you. And we had announced a pretty big training program in March, and we were expecting about 72 people were registered from around the world to come to Washington, D.C. for training. And that training, obviously, due to pandemic, we had to cancel it. And we rescheduled for August. We again canceled it. And now we are considering to do that online, virtually, sometime in November. And Elizabeth will later, my colleague, will provide more information on it. And at this point, we also run a monthly training, just discussion group on procurement once in a month. And you'll hear more about it as the program folds for today. And so this topic, I'm just going to go over some ground rules for all of us for today. As people are logging in, we have 70 people already online. So if you have any questions with speaker, as Simeon, our presenter, does presentation today, please send your questions in chat window or through questions and Q&A section, and Elizabeth will compile them and she will moderate the Q&A. And keep your phone and beeping device on silence. I think we can silence it from here as well. And stay close to the phone because some places have if Wi-Fi signal is bad, so please stay close to the Wi-Fi signal. And audio is better to keep in mute. But we are in webinar format, so I think we have already muted the audio from here. And after me, I'm introducing today's host or moderator for this session, Ms. Elizabeth Kusende. And Elizabeth is our associate in IDI. She lives in a city called Philadelphia. And so if you know the US geography, we're moving up north. I live in Washington, D.C. And about 150 miles from here, north is Elizabeth, and probably another 100 miles north is our presenter from today, Simeon. And then after Q&A, we will do a quick remarks by our managing director. And if we could not answer your questions, then please have patience. We'll try to get back to you either in our monthly meeting with those questions, or somehow we'll try to communicate to you. And having said that, Elizabeth, all is yours now.
Thank you. You move to the next slide.
Yeah, go ahead. We can hear you.
Yes. So to begin, my name is Elizabeth. As Suman mentioned, I'm the program coordinator for this program. I will start with introducing our speaker, Mr. Simon, who has at least 30 years of experience in international consulting in procurement. He's worked for organizations such as the World Bank, USAID, and also has been a senior officer at the United Nations. He holds a degree in law and a master's degree in international law from New York University. So I will have him begin his presentation, and then we'll move to Q&A. So as you have questions during his discussion, you can continue to type the questions in the Q&A. That way we have the questions ready by the time we reach our question section. So I'll give it to you, Mr. Sebon, to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Suman. Also, I'll try to be as quick as possible to run through these slides to enable there to be time for questions. Now, because of actually the time limit and this, the potential scope of this topic, what we're doing today is really presenting a panorama, an overview. We're not going into detail on any of these aspects, but for those who are interested in this subject, that panorama may be helpful. Now, a couple of things I'd like to say in the way of general remarks or introductory observations. As Suman mentioned, the COVID situation has highlighted, the urgency of emergency procurement. In particular, because it was unanticipated by most people, let's say. So there are other types of emergencies that we're more familiar with that may or may not even be considered emergencies in some systems because perhaps they're sort of predictable, and even though they have an emergency character to them, one can foresee during what time of year they might happen. I'm thinking, for example, of countries in which there are periodic flooding situations, or countries that are affected by the locust plague currently that is now affecting, in particular, East Africa. So there's a certain amount of, I would say, subjectivity involved in what is considered an emergency and what would be sufficient justification to enable or authorize use of emergency procurement procedures. So let me start on the particular points that I want to say with respect to this first slide. I want to highlight the fact that procurement, as many of you know, is challenging in any case. It's challenging in any system, whether it be a system that's advanced or a system that's less advanced. But the takeaway from that is that the more that a procurement system needs development, the more that a procurement system is challenged by capacity shortfalls, both in terms of institutions, procedures, as well as human resources and skill levels of the procurement workforce or professionalism of the procurement workforce, then the more challenging is the procurement response to emergencies. Second point I want to make as a general observation. There is no kind of one-size-fits-all prescription for the procurement response to emergencies. Typically, there are stages in an emergency, how it unrolls or evolves. And therefore, there are stages in the procurement response. And those stages are highlighted in the second point on this slide. There's the immediate procurement response to the aftermath of an emergency. Then there's something that's called very often the recovery stage. And then finally, there is the reconstruction stage. And those stages differ in terms of the criticality of urgency in the procurement response. Obviously, the immediate aftermath of an emergency, when people have to be pulled out from wreckage, or when it's just the emergency or the disaster has just happened, then obviously urgency is a particularly critical factor. And then as one goes through the further steps and stages of the emergency, that urgency factor may take on gradually less important or less critical weight. And then in addition to those stages, there is something called phase out, okay? So it's important to note that when emergency or extraordinary procurement procedures are applied, they're not applied forever. So there has to be a process of reverting back to the normal procurement procedures, and that's sometimes called phase out. Another general remark that I would make is the point of, or the principle of inclusion. Okay, there are many stakeholders in an emergency situation. Government officials, donors, the private sector, civil society. And you will see in some of the other slides that the issue of inclusion as a characteristic of the procurement response is very important. And it's not just important from the standpoint, let's say, of purely sort of more abstract governance principles, like open government and open contracting principle, but the principle of inclusion is very important from a practical point of view. And to illustrate that, I would cite the potential role of civil society in monitoring contract implementation. And that's particularly relevant in the context of certain types of emergencies which may be happening in remote locations where it's difficult, perhaps because of the emergency itself, for the government officials to reach the place, or there may be safety or security issues involved. So in that practical sense, the principle of inclusion is implemented through the use of civil society to monitor the implementation of the contracts. That's true for procurement generally, but it's particularly true in the emergency context potentially. Another general observation is that the challenges of emergency procurement are particularly, let's say, exacerbated in the context of fragility, conflict, and violence, so-called FCV circumstances. And related to that is kind of more than just an analytical question, because how one makes this analysis may dictate what procedures are applied. There's a kind of a gray area between the notion of emergency procurement, for example, in response to a disaster, and the provisions in a procurement legal framework that may authorize the implementation of special procedures for security or national defense purposes. And that can come up as, perhaps a somewhat puzzling question and difficult to decide, because the emergency procurement procedures have to do with streamlining and other steps to allow urgent delivery, urgent payment, whereas security considerations or national defense considerations in procurement legal frameworks have more to do with exemptions or exclusions, for example, from advertisement requirements or from competition requirements. So there's an overlap, and there may be some tricky questions involved in sorting those types of issues out and deciding what should be the procedure applied. The last thing I want to mention from this slide before we move on is the role of SMEs. One of the characteristics of emergencies is that when one is examining the availability of suppliers and contractors, it may be that due to the emergency, it's only the local resources, the local companies that are actually available to do something. So there is an important potential role for small and medium-sized enterprises that we should note. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is also kind of an introductory point, and that has to do with the different types of emergencies. There's the single event emergency, which is like a cyclone, earthquake. And these can be actually either natural or man-made. If there's, for example, I don't know if this is a good metaphor, but it comes to mind, for example, the explosion in Beirut. That presumably it's a man-made event, but it's catastrophic. So these are examples of single event. Then there's the continuous crises, sort of prolonged wars. The last type of emergency is the chronic slow onset. The single event is a quick onset. The last one is a slow onset, and that is illustrated by droughts, malnutrition, famine, difficult circumstances of that nature. Next slide, please. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Now this slide has to do with preparedness for emergencies. Now, it may seem a bit ironic, at least on first impression, to hear the term preparedness for emergencies, but it's really not. The idea here is that there are certain steps that a procurement system can take to prepare in advance for the possibility that emergencies of one type or another may occur. And that's those types of steps to establish preparedness for emergency procurement can be very helpful. For example, the first one, integration of the procurement function into national disaster preparedness and risk reduction plans. The idea there is that the procurement function should be represented in the process of establishing national disaster preparedness. The procurement function should be represented in the national disaster teams that are, to one extent or another, established or constituted before any emergency, but just as a matter of preparedness. Another step for preparedness for emergencies, so that the system doesn't have to scramble to do this after an emergency has occurred. And that's the development of emergency procurement procedures. And that can be in the form of provisions in the regulations supporting the implementation of the procurement law or the Procurement Act, or in the form of guidance material or something like that. The other steps here have to do with constituting or compiling information that will be useful when the time comes to conduct emergency procurement. For example, and this may be a particularly important one, and that's the identification of different types of supplies and services, and I include in that works, that may be needed to respond to an emergency of one sort or another. And there's some examples listed here. A corollary to that is the identification of potential qualified suppliers and contractors and consultants that would be listed and that would be available to be called upon without delay in the event of an emergency. Another type of, let's say, information gathering function that is related to preparedness has to do with liaison with UN agencies and donor organizations that may be involved in the emergency response. And that is gathering information as to what their capabilities are, what types of goods and services they can provide, and things of that nature. The last type of preparedness steps, or category of preparedness steps, has to do with, let's say, procedural steps and procedures that will be particularly helpful in implementing an effective emergency procurement response. For example, setting up in advance of any emergency, standby framework agreements, so that the procuring entities that are involved in emergency response have available to them suppliers that are ready to supply whatever the goods, works, and services that are necessary to respond to the emergency when it arises. And the terms of the contracts that would be issued under those framework agreements are to a large extent defined in the umbrella framework agreement or panel agreement. Call it what you want. These agreements are called different names in different systems, but probably the most common name is framework agreement. And those are particularly useful not only in procurement generally, but in particular to establish in advance for preparedness purposes. Another procedural type of mechanism that is very helpful is the establishment of standard forms, including standard forms of contract for conducting emergency procurement. And these should be more streamlined and simplified as compared to the normal standard processing forms and bidding documents, which may be quite bulky. Another one is simplified payment procedures. So I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there. I don't know whether the participants will have access to the slides in any way, but there's some additional points that we don't have time to go into there. The next slide, please. Yes?
Simeon, we will give access to the slide after the presentation to everyone.
Great, then I feel better about skipping some of the points because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, the next slide is coverage of the procurement cycle. This is a simple kind of self-evident point, but I think it bears repeating and emphasis. And that is, as in procurement generally, the procurement process or the procurement cycle has mainly 3 key stages, and that's planning, acquisition meaning the process of soliciting bids, evaluating bids, and awarding the contract. So actually, legally acquiring something. And then the last phase or stage is the contract implementation and contract management stage. Now, obviously in emergency procurement, each one of those stages is complicated, but it's important to remember that they nevertheless have to be followed. And we're going to look at what some of the planning steps are in the next couple of slides. And this is, yeah, okay. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, the next slide, this is sort of a planning, sort of procurement planning, but it's almost like pre-planning in the sense that there are certain steps that need to be taken in the immediate aftermath of the emergency that will enable the actual planning. And the first one that's mentioned there is assessment of the situation. And that is, taking stock of what exactly is the nature and scope of the emergency and what the needs are in order to meet that emergency and the circumstances in which the procurement would have to be conducted and the contract delivered. So there are basically 2 types of issues under this assessment of the situation point. Number 1, having to do with the nature of the emergency. Number 2, issues relating to the access. Is for example, in an earthquake situation, what kind of access is there, or if it's a conflict situation, what are the, and not only a conflict situation, but also in the other, what are the safety and security aspects of the situation? The next point, issuance of any necessary declaration. Now, typically it's not up necessarily, I suppose it varies from system to system, but I've run into this, and I think it's fairly widely applicable, that it's not up to procurement alone to declare that there's an emergency, particularly if one is to invoke extraordinary procedures. So this is just to say that typically, or in many cases, in order to authorize or justify the use of emergency procurement procedures, there would have to be some sort of a declaration of a state of emergency or of the existence of emergency, some sort of declaration like that to validate the fact that there's an emergency and to give the green light for these special procedures to be applied. Survey of what is needed. That's sort of linked, obviously, to the assessment of the situation. Identification of the main actors. That's crucial information. And again, we see the multiple stakeholders involved. And the last point, assessment of logistical preparedness of the area. And obviously, you know, if there's going to be large shipments, there have to be the logistical facilities and resources available in that area or in close proximity as possible to enable delivery and distribution and storage. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, now here we get into the actual planning. There are multiple points here. We don't have time to go over them, but you can see them when you have access to the slides. I've sort of summarized them in 3 categories. One category, the first category, is the establishment of communication and reporting channels or information flow among the various stakeholders and coordination. And that's a particularly good illustration, or that category of planning steps illustrates well the importance of preparedness, because to one extent or another, these communication channels that allow the information to flow among the stakeholders, the coordination procedures could be, let's say, foreseen and outlined in some of the steps that we saw for establishing advanced preparedness for emergency. The next step, or the next category of planning issues, I label as inclusion, okay? And that has to do with inclusion of, you know, various stakeholders, be they governmental or non-governmental. For example, local communities. The last category has to do with kind of a market assessment, you know, what suppliers and contractors and from where would be available to meet the procurement needs, and to identify the applicable procedures. And to one extent or another, the assessment of the available market for the emergency procurement may drive the identification of what procedures are applicable. Because obviously, if there are only a limited number of suppliers that are available for one reason or the other, that would point to the possible use of less competitive methods of procurement. The last thing that I want to mention, and that's the last bullet point on this slide, has to do with, let's say, the risk that when an emergency is declared or there is the possibility for one reason or another to engage in emergency procurement, the risk that some entities may try to, you know, under the banner of emergency procurement, load their procurement program with all sorts of stuff that isn't really needed or is beyond what is needed to respond to an emergency. So that's a risk that the system needs to control, because I think the fundamental principle, or a fundamental principle of emergency procurement, is that the procurement should be limited to what is required to meet the emergency, because typically the public purchaser will not be getting the best terms for emergency procurement. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, procurement procedures. Now there's the first well, I guess the whole slide deals with principles, actually, because as this is a panorama, we're not discussing in detail how procurement procedures should be modified or could be modified. The first bullet point mentions that in emergencies, the same principles that apply to procurement generally should apply also to emergency procurement: transparency, accountability, competition, access to information, inclusive governance procedures for the procurement system and for the procurement process. Those should apply to the greatest extent possible in emergency procurement. The next bullet point highlights principles that apply to the procurement procedures or the procurement methods, specifically from the perspective of fulfilling procurement requirements urgently. And those principles are speed, simplicity, and flexibility. So there is kind of let's say, conflicting considerations and conflicting values or competing values between those general procurement principles and the principles of speed, simplicity, and flexibility that are needed in order to have responsive emergency procurement. So there's a compromise, there's a trade-off involved here. And there are examples in the third bullet point, there are examples of how that trade-off may be expressed. For example, there may be elevated ceilings for the use of the request for quotations or shopping method above what would normally apply. There may be greater access to direct procurement or single source procurement. There may be streamlined documentation. It's not necessarily a flexibility, but there is the possibility, and it makes sense in some cases for the government to actually, instead of contracting, to carry out the work itself, and that's sometimes referred to as force account. So there are these types of flexibilities that are necessary in some cases to respond to an emergency. Some flexibilities are more, let's say, risky than other flexibilities. For example, if a procurement system were to allow advance payments to be made without a full guarantee being supplied by the contractor for the advance payment, that's risky. It may be necessary, but it's a more risky approach. Last point I want to mention here is back to the SMEs. To the extent that there may be procedural flexibility and simplification of procurement methods, this may have the benefit of easing administrative burdens for participation by SMEs. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Just a few words about the Reconstruction phase. And that's, I guess, the final, one can call it the final phase of emergency procurement, or the final phase of procurement response to emergencies. You remember that I mentioned at the outset something called the phase-out stage. Well, this is actually the phase-out stage begins during the Reconstruction. It's during the Reconstruction stage that there should begin the reversion to normal procurement procedures. That doesn't mean that it should be, a big bang, all or nothing reversion to normal procedures, but there's the beginning of the reversion to normal procedures, to the extent that accelerated procedures would be reserved only for critical infrastructure or other critical procurement. But the norm here begins to be revert back to the normal procurement procedures. Next slide, please. The next slide deals with contract implementation and management. Okay, we mentioned already contract forms. These may be simplified contracts, which contain only essential provisions, price, specifications, fraud and corruption clauses, really the core set of procedures. These would be contract forms that would be relevant in particular to the more urgent stages of the emergency process or the emergency history. Obviously, if you're reverting back to the normal procedures, such contract forms would be less relevant. You can use your normal contracts. But generally, in terms of contract implementation and management, it's relevant in all stages, whether it be in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, in the recovery stage, or in the reconstruction stage. At each of those stages, contract implementation and management is something that has to be implemented as properly as possible, as thoroughly and diligently as possible. The last point on this slide, techniques for contract performance monitoring, and this highlights, let's say I don't want to say unusual, but let's say special procedures that may be implemented for contract management in emergency situations. An enhanced role for civil society in contract performance monitoring, and the use of technology, for example, geotagging, are two examples. Let's move to the next slide. And this has to do with accountability. Okay, accountability, and that's obviously because the risk involved in applying streamlined or simplified procedures for contracts, some of which may be larger than the value to which streamlined procedures would normally be applied. There's a greater risk, let's say, of abuses. So it's important to emphasize that at each stage of the emergency, all procurement needs to be properly documented. There have to be applicable record requirements. There should be one of the key planning steps at the beginning should be the establishment of a log of procurement activities, so that each contractual action is noted, and those records will then make it possible for the audit institution to conduct its audit. Now, equally important to ex post audit is the existence of effective ex ante control systems, but those are let's say not necessarily strong in all countries. And in an emergency situation, those issues of internal financial control and internal audit, as well as external audit, are particularly challenged. The other point that I want to highlight here is the notion of social accountability, and that's where the engagement and the inclusion of civil society plays the key role. Last slide, please. Other issues. I mentioned already the phase out. Just to add to what we have already said, there are some steps other than, or in addition to just reverting to normal procurement procedures. There's also the issue of what to do with excess and unused supplies that were procured for the emergency response, and also the evaluation as part of the phase-out process of the effectiveness of the procurement transactions that took place in response to the emergency, so that lessons can be learned and applied in the next emergency. Now, part of that after-action evaluation process can be aided by the establishment of performance measurement frameworks, performance indicators, KPIs for emergency procurement. And some examples of the many possible indicators are given here. For example, timeliness of deliveries, differences in prices between what's procured on an emergency basis as compared to what's procured in normal circumstances, timeliness of payments, and satisfaction of affected communities, which is like a user survey or something like that. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that we didn't give more information than we could, but I hope that this was helpful.
Thank you, Simon. Elizabeth, now we move to Q&A.
So, did you unmute me? Okay. So I will start with, basically the question is, what is OC and OGP principles?
OC stands for open contracting, and OGC stands for OGP, which I hope I spelled right, stands for open government partnership. There's common, let's say, a significant degree of commonality between those two sets of principles. They both promote access to information, in particular for the civil society, and also engagement or inclusion of civil society so as to allow a meaningful role, in particular for monitoring of contract performance, for example. But it also applies to other stages of the procurement process, both of those. And you can look them up on the internet, and they're actually interesting from the standpoint of procurement reform, because procurement is probably like the main battlefield in fighting for transparency in government because it so affects the use of taxpayer money and the delivery of services.
Okay, so we'll move to the next question. Basically, the question says, with likely price inflation at emergency period, how do we capture price variation clause in contract management?
That's a good question. Maybe the question highlights perhaps another possible flexibility that one might allow in emergency context. In many systems that allow revision or adjustment of price to contracts, those price adjustment clauses, which are clauses in the contract with formulas and stuff like that, they operate only or apply or available only to contracts of a longer duration. For example, 18 months, I think, is the figure that the World Bank uses. Perhaps in an emergency situation where there is instability, chronic instability in prices, those types of requirements may be modified to allow a more responsive real-time adjustment of price.
Okay, thank you. And the next question. Okay, the next question goes, given that public procurement is such a rule based on process, how is it that the UK government is avoiding transparency in awarding COVID-related emergency contracts?
I'm not familiar with the UK procurement process in awarding contracts for COVID response, so I can't comment in detail. But I would just say that you know what was mentioned a few minutes ago, that there is a trade-off between principles like transparency and speed, which may be needed to respond to an emergency. I'm not familiar with the issue in the UK, so I don't want to say anything to absolve you know, any malpractices that may be taking place. But I think the example highlights that trade-off But at the same time, the trade-off shouldn't trade away transparency completely.
Thank you. And the next question is, emergency situations always open up vulnerability for fraud. What steps can we put to ensure adequate check on quality of the use of the simplified procedure?
Well, in emergency situation, the core elements of a procurement process that prevents or let's say suppresses corruption or simply delivery of substandard goods, or what was delivery of something that was not expected by the purchaser, the core steps have to be followed. There have to be clear specifications. If the procuring entity, drafts a lousy contract with specifications that aren't clear, well, that's going to create problems whether it's in an emergency or not. Another way to, of course, to suppress, let's say, abuses that are not of a technical nature is that there needs to be some sort of a governance process, some sort of a workflow process for authorizing payments. And if the problem isn't caught before, at the time of payment, there should be, hopefully, some sort of an ex ante control that ensures that what was delivered was what the supplier was contracted to deliver and not something else. Those are two steps that come to mind, but I think this is an important question that deserves a longer discussion.
Okay, and the next question says, let's see this one. Kindly explain the zero allocation clause.
Okay, the zero allocation is a clause in a project document. In a project document, I'm not sure whether it's actually. I don't think it's actually reflected in the contractual instruments, but it's a clause in a project document that foresees the possibility that there may be some unexpected emergency that arises. And it authorizes, without particularly defining the scope of it, it authorizes the possibility that there would have to be expenditures made for that to respond to such an emergency. Some of you participants may actually know more about it than I do.
Okay, and then this question basically, it says some emergencies are not easy to generate in advance. How could we ensure that the right suppliers know about emergency procurement process?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Yes, so let me go back to it. Some emergencies are not easy to generate in advance. How could we ensure the right suppliers know about emergency procurement process?
Well, that's a good question. One technique, you remember a few minutes ago we mentioned that part of the preparedness, the package of steps to establish preparedness, is to identify what types of goods, works, and services might be needed to respond to a particular, to a variety of possible emergencies. And the corollary to that was the possibility of establishing a list of suppliers and contractors and consultants that are pre-qualified to respond, or sort of in the same neighborhood, the pre-establishment of framework agreements. So the establishment of such lists of suppliers and contractors and consultants may be one technique that could be used to familiarize, to make the market more susceptible of being mobilized in the case of an emergency. And the framework, pre-establishment of framework agreements may be even a more direct way of doing that. So there are a variety of techniques. And of course, there's the general publicity that the procurement system should provide about itself. You know, there should be a central web portal for the procurement system in which information about the procedures, including emergency procurement, are available to all interested parties.
Okay, and the other question is there a way to control prices in times of emergency?
That's difficult. It's more difficult than usual because there may be a certain, particularly in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, the risk of having to pay more obviously is greater. So it's hard to make a very general statement on that. It depends on the criticality of the situation. But obviously, the procurement system should take every step possible to try to protect itself from being extorted. And that's one of the reasons that it's important to try to have even some modicum of competition, even in the immediate aftermath of an emergency. And that highlights the importance of preparedness. Because, for example, if one establishes a framework agreement on a standby basis to use only when there's an emergency, there can be certain parameters already established with respect to pricing.
Okay, and let's see. I don't have any other specific question. And also,
there's some in chat box, I think, Elizabeth. I think some came in chat box. One or two, not that many.
I answered the two in the chat box.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, chat box, yes. Yeah, I don't have any more questions that have come in.
So I'll just move forward with this. So Suman again. So thank you, Simeon, for a wonderful presentation. I think it was very knowledgeable. I was getting lots of compliment on the chat box by our participants. And we have 90 people altogether at the peak time, and we had people from about, I think, 16 different countries. So that's a very good response to the webinar. You know, that says people are really interested around the world for this topic at this point. And before we move on to the next, I want to recognize our colleague Anand Kumar, who joined in here, and Anand and Elizabeth. They run a monthly webinar group. And Elizabeth will give you a schedule, and you can email us the email that you got invitation from this webinar. You can write to them if you are interested. If you haven't joined that group, and you're welcome to join that monthly group. And the group is just growing, and it's very informative, and there is no cost to it. And we also are coming up with a 10 days. 2.5 hours training a day and complete training package for November. Just look out for an announcement sometime next week. We will email everyone who was registered for this program, plus other mailing lists. Join us in LinkedIn and in our Facebook. And then all I have to say is just stay safe wherever you are. Just follow your local protocol, whatever you have to follow, because it's a tough time for all of us. So having said that, I will invite our Managing Director, Parshu Nepal, to close the session. Parshu?
Thank you, Shimon, and thank you, Simeon, more importantly, for coming online this morning to talk about this emergency procurement preparedness thing. I'm sorry, I guess some of our participants experienced some technical glitches in logging in, but we will share this recording to them. And also, we may or may not have answered all the questions fully and adequately. This is our effort to engage with procurement professionals and the community during these difficult times. Stay tuned for other future programs, future webinars, and send us topics of your interest. We will try to accommodate them, as much as possible. Lastly, but not least, remember us for any procurement related training programs, capacity building programs, as well as consulting work. So we are here to help, and we have a capacity to cater to your needs. So with this, I would like to say thank you to Simeon and my team for putting this important and timely webinar. Thank you.
Okay, and one thing I'm
Elizabeth?
noticing, yes, there are some questions that are coming in. We can respond to those at a later time, and you can feel free to send email. And when you get a chance, please visit our website. You can read a full biography of our speaker for today, Simon. There's lots of interesting things about him, and also honored on our website. And as Suman mentioned, we'll be sending information about the program, which we are running in November.
Thank you.
Suman, you are muted. You're saying something, but we can't hear you.
You're muted.
Sorry, I was just saying that the video and the presentation will be made available on the website, and I will send out a link by tomorrow to all of you, so that you can just refer to that document and the video, share with your colleagues, and join our group. And it was broadcasted live on the Facebook, on IDI Web Facebook. Check it out, share it. We are in LinkedIn. We have a LinkedIn group. Join us, and this community is just growing. Having said that, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, good day, good night, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Thank you, Simeon, once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to
and
IDI
for joining.
and all of you.